The dust tasted of endings. Annaba had known the scent of the earth her entire life. The sweet perfume of pine after a rain, the dry, herbal aroma of sun-baked manzanita, the damp, loamy smell of the riverbank where she and her sister, Nita, gathered clay. But this new dust was different. It was sharp, metallic, and carried on a wind that no longer whispered of seasons, but of invasion. It rose in faint plumes from the valley below, a constant reminder of the white men who had gouged a raw, weeping wound into the land they called unclaimed. Her village, nestled in a small, sheltered meadow in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, had always been a place of balance. The rhythm of their lives was tied to the sun, the salmon runs, and the acorn harvest. But now, that rhythm was broken, replaced by the distant, percussive clang of iron on rock. It was a sound that made the elders' faces tighten and the children fall silent. Annaba was returning from the oak grove, her basket heavy with the last of the season's acorns, when she saw them. 3 men on horseback, their figures dark and imposing against the afternoon sun. They weren't traders. Their clothes were caked with mud and grime, and they carried long rifles with a casual menace. They rode directly into the center of the village, their horses trampling the carefully tended herb gardens without a second glance. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled Nita, who had run to greet her, behind her back, her small hand clutching Annaba's deerskin dress. The village fell into a hushed, watchful stillness. Chaitin, one of the tribal elders, stepped forward, his body frail but his posture unyielding. He raised a hand in the traditional gesture of greeting, speaking in their native tongue, his voice calm but firm. One of the miners, a burly man with a tangled, sun-bleached beard and eyes the color of a faded sky, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Chaitin's feet. "Don't understand that gibberish, old man," he sneered. His voice was a harsh, gravelly sound, like stones grinding together. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. "We're here for the color. This land, this creek, it's ours now, by right of discovery." He gestured vaguely toward the surrounding hills, a sweeping, possessive motion that encompassed their homes, their burial grounds, their entire world. Another elder, a woman named Kaya, spoke up, her voice sharp with indignation. She pointed to the village, to the smoke rising from their lodges, her gestures making it clear that this land was, and always had been, their home. The bearded man simply laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Your home? This is California, property of the United States of America. You're squatting." His gaze swept over the villagers, lingering on the women with a cold, appraising look that made Annaba's skin crawl. She felt Nita tremble behind her and pulled her closer, shielding her small body with her own. Chaitin tried again, his tone more urgent, pointing to the river and making gestures of drinking, of fishing. He was trying to explain that their lifeblood flowed from that water, the same water the miners were now turning to mud and poison. The leader, Silas, seemed to understand only what he wanted to. "The water's for mining," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need it, you can find another puddle to drink from." With that, he turned back to his horse, but paused, his cold eyes locking onto Annaba. For a moment, she felt pinned by his stare, like a moth to a board. He saw her defiance, her fear, and the protective arm she kept wrapped around her sister. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "You've got a week," he said, his voice carrying across the silent clearing. "Pack up your trinkets and be gone. This land is for men who know how to use it." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving behind a cloud of that sharp, metallic dust and a silence more profound and terrifying than any sound. Annaba held her sister tight, watching the men disappear, knowing they had not just delivered a threat. They had pronounced a sentence. The day after Silas's ultimatum dawned not with the familiar chorus of birdsong, but with a heavy, suffocating silence. The air in the village was thick with unspoken fear, a palpable weight that settled over every dwelling. Annaba watched as her people moved with a somber quietness, their usual morning rituals of weaving and preparing food now performed with a mechanical listlessness. The children, usually a source of vibrant chaos, clung to their mothers' sides, their wide eyes reflecting the anxiety of the adults. By mid-morning, the elders convened a council near the great oak that stood at the heart of the village. Annaba sat at the edge of the circle with the other young women, her hands clenched in her lap. Elder Kyan, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 100 seasons, spoke first. His voice was raspy but carried the authority of experience. "The earth has given us a warning," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. "These men are like a rockslide, powerful, destructive, and without reason. To stand against them is to be buried. We must think of the children. We must find a new place, a quieter stream." His words were met with a murmur of frightened agreement, but it was quickly cut short by Chaitan, a young warrior whose muscles were tight with indignation. He stood abruptly, his chest puffed out. "Run, we are Medu. This land holds the bones of our ancestors. The river gives us life. Are we to abandon their spirits to these, greedy ghosts who see only yellow rock? My spear is sharp. My arm is strong. We should fight, not cower like frightened deer." His passionate plea ignited a spark among the younger men, who nodded in fervent support. The council dissolved into a tense debate, a clash between the wisdom of survival and the fire of pride. Annaba felt torn. Kyan's words resonated with the cold dread in her stomach, the primal urge to protect her family. But Chaitan's anger mirrored the flame of injustice burning in her own heart. Were they truly to be swept away so easily? Needing to escape the suffocating tension, Annaba slipped away and walked toward the river, her sanctuary. But the sounds that reached her were wrong. Not the gentle rush of water over smooth stones, but the jarring thud of axes against wood and the grating sound of metal on rock. As she neared the bank, her heart sank. Across the water, where a grove of ancient pines had stood, there was now a ragged clearing. The miners were building their camp. Their shouts, coarse and alien, echoed across the canyon, a violation of the sacred quiet. The river itself was changing. A murky brown cloud bled into the clear water downstream from their activity, a foul stain spreading from their new settlement. The fish would flee from such poison. The plants along the bank would wither. They weren't just claiming the land, they were killing it. Annaba watched, hidden by the willows, as Silas directed the others, his gestures sharp and impatient. They moved with a brutal efficiency, tearing into the landscape as if it were a canvas they were determined to destroy. They had paid no heed to the one-week deadline. Their invasion had already begun. The sight solidified something within her. It was no longer a distant threat spoken in the council circle. It was an open wound on the land, a physical manifestation of their greed. That night, Annaba couldn't sleep. The low glow of the miners' campfires was visible through the trees, an unnatural orange that pulsed like a fever on the dark horizon. The sounds of their raucous laughter and drunken singing drifted on the wind, a mockery of her people's fearful silence. The debate in the council had settled nothing, but watching the miners desecrate the river had settled everything for her. Kyan was right that they couldn't stop a rockslide head-on, but Chaitan was also right that they couldn't simply run. There had to be another way, a path between being crushed and being erased. As she watched the enemy fires burn, Annaba knew she could not just wait for the men to decide her fate. A quiet resolve began to harden within her, as solid and cold as a river stone in winter. The sun had not yet breached the jagged peaks of the Sierra when Annaba slipped away from the village. She moved with the silence of a shadow, her moccasins making no sound on the familiar carpet of pine needles. The debate in the longhouse had raged through the night, Chaitan's fiery words clashing against Kyan's weary pragmatism, but Annaba found no answers in their arguments. Her answer lay ahead, in the belly of the beast that was devouring her world. She carried no weapon, only the weight of her purpose. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but resolve was a steady warmth that spread through her limbs. She found her vantage point on a rocky outcrop shrouded by manzanita bushes, a place she had known since childhood. Below, the miners' camp was a raw, festering wound on the land. The crisp morning air was tainted with the acrid smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Dozens of men, more than she had imagined, moved with a chaotic, ant-like industry. Their voices were a harsh, alien rumble, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of axes and the grating screech of saws. They were a force of nature unto themselves, tearing down the forest that had stood for generations to build crude shelters and sluice boxes. Annaba watched them for hours, memorizing their faces, their routines, the way they stacked their rifles carelessly against tree stumps. They were loud, disorganized, and utterly confident in their power. They saw the land not as a living entity, but as a vault to be broken into and looted. When she returned to the village, a grim silence had fallen. The source was the river. The once clear water that tumbled over the smooth stones was now a sluggish, brown trickle. The miners had built a crude dam upstream, diverting the bulk of the water for their sluicing operations. Women stood at the riverbank with empty baskets, their faces etched with disbelief and despair. The river was their life, and it was dying before their eyes. The sight shattered the last remnants of Chaitin's patience. "They choke our water, they steal our future," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Will we sit here and thirst while they grow rich? We must act." Ignoring Kyan's pleas for caution, he gathered a small party of the strongest hunters. "We will find meat. We will show them we are not yet ghosts." Annaba's heart sank as she watched them go, their jaws set with grim determination. Later that afternoon, their desperate hunt found its mark. A large buck, its antlers tangled in the undergrowth. As they closed in, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. The buck collapsed. 4 miners emerged from the trees, laughing, their leader leveling his smoking rifle at Chaitin. "Looks like you were tracking our dinner for us, boy," the man sneered. "This is Maidu land, that is our kill." Chaitin's hand tightened on his bow, but he was hopelessly outmatched. His hunters had bows and spears, the miners had rifles and pistols holstered at their hips. "This land belongs to whoever can hold it," the miner replied, his smile vanishing. He gestured with his rifle. "And right now, we're holding all the cards. Get lost, before you and your friends end up just as dead as that deer." Defeated and humiliated, Chaitin and his men returned empty-handed. Their rage was now a smoldering ember of shame. The confrontation had proven what Annaba already knew from her perch on the outcrop. To fight them on their terms was to lose. Brute force would be met with greater force. That evening, as the village faced a future of thirst and hunger, Annaba looked toward the flickering lights of the miners' camp. She had seen their strength, but she had also seen their arrogance, their carelessness. Her path was not Chaitin's. Her war would not be fought with arrows and spears, but with the silence, the stones, and the secrets of the land itself. A blanket of heavy silence had fallen over the village, thicker and more suffocating than the smoke from the morning fires. Chaitin's defeat had extinguished the last embers of open defiance. He now sat alone by the edge of the woods, his back to his people, a stone figure carved from humiliation. The warriors who had once followed him now averted their eyes, their shoulders slumped with the weight of their powerlessness. The elders murmured prayers to the spirits, but their words felt thin, carried away by the same wind that brought the clanging sounds of the miners' hammers. Annaba watched it all, her heart aching for her people, but inside her, a different fire was being stoked. Fear had been its kindling, but resolve was now its fuel. They had tried the warrior's path and failed. Now they would try hers. She slipped away from the village's collective grief, finding solace in the deep woods where the pines stood as silent witnesses. Here, she could think. She spread out a piece of dried deer hide, using charcoal to sketch the miners' camp from memory. The location of the tents, the guard patrol routes she'd observed, the large supply tent set slightly apart from the others. They were loud, arrogant, and careless. They drank heavily in the evenings, their laughter echoing like a violation in the sacred quiet of the night. She remembered their food stores, haphazardly stacked in the supply tent. They were unfamiliar with this land, blind to its dangers and its gifts. That would be their undoing. Her mind sifted through the lessons of her grandmother. She thought of the plants that healed and the plants that harmed. There was one in particular, a root that, when dried and powdered, caused not death, but a torment of the gut. It brought fever, cramps, and a profound weakness that could last for days. It was a plant the Maidu used in tiny quantities for certain ceremonies, but in a larger dose, it was a debilitating poison. To the miners, its effects would mimic the dysentery that often plagued such filthy camps. They would blame the water they'd already fouled or the meat they left out in the sun. They would never suspect the silent hand that delivered it. Her target was set, their sacks of flour, the bland, pale dust they relied on for every meal. That night, with the moon a slim, silver crescent hidden by clouds, Anaba moved. Dressed in dark hides, her feet bare to better feel the earth, she was a shadow among shadows. The camp was a wound on the land, its firelight a feverish orange glow against the darkness. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and frying bacon, a smell of rot and invasion. She crept closer, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Two men stood guard, but they were talking loudly, passing a bottle between them, their attention fixed on the fire. She circled wide, using the noise of the now-dammed river to mask the whisper of her steps. The supply tent flap was unsecured. She slipped inside, the darkness thick with the alien scent of canvas and cured tobacco. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Sacks of flour, sugar, and beans were piled high. She found the opened flour sacks they were currently using, her fingers trembling as she untied the leather pouch at her waist. Inside was the fine, dark powder. This was the moment. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the image of Chaitin's bowed head and the elders' desperate faces held her in place. With methodical purpose, she poured a generous amount of the powder into each of the 3 open sacks, using a stick to carefully stir it deep into the flour, leaving no trace. A floorboard creaked outside. Anaba froze, melting into the shadows behind a stack of crates. One of the guards ambled past, muttering to himself, before returning to the fire. Anaba waited until the sound of his footsteps faded completely, then slipped back out of the tent and into the welcoming darkness of the forest, leaving nothing behind but a silent, potent promise of misery. The dawn broke thin and gray, a pale wash over the eastern ridges. Anaba was already in position, concealed within a dense thicket of manzanita on the slope overlooking the miners' camp. Her heart was a tight, frantic drum against her ribs. The waiting was a torment, a silent scream in her mind. Had it worked? Or had she risked everything for nothing? The first signs were subtle. The usual clamor of the camp was muted. There was the crackle of campfires, yes, but not the gruff laughter and clang of metal on stone that typically shattered the morning quiet. Then she saw them, emerging from their crude tents one by one. They moved slowly, their shoulders hunched. One man stumbled to the edge of the camp and retched violently into the bushes. Soon, another followed. A low, collective groan seemed to hang in the damp air like a foul mist. From the largest tent, Silas emerged, his face a thundercloud. He barked an order, his voice rough with impatience. "Get to it! That dam won't build itself." His words were met not with the usual flurry of activity, but with pained grunts and shuffling feet. A lanky miner with a red beard clutched his stomach. "Can't, Silas. Something ain't right. The biscuits, my guts are on fire." Silas's face hardened. He strode over and kicked a nearby crate, the wood splintering. "Fire? I'll give you fire. It's bad water and weak stomachs. Now get to work before I dock you all a day's pay." But his threats were empty. Men tried to lift pickaxes and shovels, only to drop them, their faces pale with sweat. The work on the dam, the source of her people's suffering, had ground to a halt. A cold, sharp thrill shot through Anaba. It was working. Her knowledge, the quiet power of the earth, was a weapon they couldn't see and didn't understand. She watched as Silas stomped around the camp, his rage mounting with every sick man he saw. His eyes scanned the surrounding woods, a flicker of suspicion in them. He didn't know what was happening, and that uncertainty was making him dangerous. She slipped away before the sun was high, her movements as silent as a shadow. Back in her own village, the mood was still heavy. Chaitin was trying to rally the other young men, his voice filled with frustration. "See, they are weak. The spirits are displeased with them. Now is the time to strike. Anaba's stomach clenched. They saw the miners' weakness but attributed it to the wrong cause. They didn't understand that this was a calculated attack, not a spiritual omen. She wanted to scream, to tell them that their reckless charge would ruin everything. But she held her tongue, the secret a burning coal in her throat. Her solitude was now a necessary shield. To speak would be to invite disaster not only upon herself, but upon the very strategy that was finally offering a sliver of hope. She met her mother's gaze across the village center. The older woman's eyes were full of worry, but as they locked on Anaba, there was a flicker of questioning, a hint of understanding that made Anaba's breath catch. She quickly looked away, retreating to the quiet solitude of her family's dwelling. As evening fell, Anaba returned to her lookout. The miners' camp was eerily quiet. Most of the men were confined to their tents, and the fires burned low. Silas stood alone near the edge of the clearing, staring at the silent, half-built dam. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was unnerved. He looked over his shoulder toward the dark silhouette of the Medu village, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. The seed of paranoia had been planted. Anaba felt a surge of grim satisfaction, but it was chased by a cold wave of fear. She had proven her strategy could work, but in doing so, she had turned Silas's ignorant greed into focused, fearful suspicion, and she knew that was a far more dangerous beast to face. The sickness clung to the miners' camp like the oppressive heat of the California sun. Silas watched from his tent, his knuckles white as he gripped a wooden post. The fever had broken in most of his men, but it left behind a bone-deep weakness and a lingering cough that echoed through the canyon. His frustration had curdled into a cold, hard certainty. This was no act of God, it was an attack, a silent, insidious poison. His gaze drifted toward the distant smoke rising from the Medu village. They were celebrating, he was sure of it, mocking his men's weakness. "They think we're finished," he rasped to his second-in-command, a gaunt man named Miller. "They think they can wait us out while we wither away." Miller wiped sweat from his brow. "What are we gonna do, Silas? The men can barely lift a shovel, let alone a rifle." "We don't need to lift rifles to make them bleed," Silas snarled, a cruel idea taking root in his fevered mind. "They poisoned us. We'll make them thirst." He straightened up, his voice gaining a raw power that cut through the camp's lethargy. "Get every man who can walk. We're paying our neighbors a visit." The sight of the miners was terrifying. They were no longer a robust, arrogant force, but a collection of hollow-eyed specters, their faces pale under the sun, leaning on their rifles like crutches. They didn't march to the Medu village, but to the last small creek that still trickled with clean water, the one the tribe now depended on since the main river was choked with mud. Without a word, they formed a loose, menacing line along the bank, their rifles held loosely but pointedly toward the village path. The news spread through the Medu camp like a wildfire. Women gathering reeds dropped their baskets and ran, their faces etched with panic. The tribe's lifeline was now guarded by sick, desperate men who looked ready to shoot at any shadow. This was the spark Chaitin had been waiting for. He vaulted onto a large rock in the center of the village, his face a mask of fury. "Do you see now?" he roared, his voice booming across the suddenly silent clearing. "They are weak, they are dying, and still they spit on us. They take our water and dare us to challenge them. The spirits have given us this chance, and you would let it pass." His words resonated with the fear and anger simmering within the tribe. Warriors grabbed their spears, their eyes glowing with a renewed fire. This was a clear act of war, an insult that could not be ignored. Anaba watched from the edge of the crowd, a cold dread washing over her. This was her fault. Her secret victory had become a public threat, pushing her people toward a slaughter. She saw the path ahead clearly. Chaitin would lead the warriors into a hail of bullets, and their village would be burned to the ground in retaliation. She had to stop it. She pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding against her ribs, and stood before Chaitin. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his tirade. He glared down at her. "Move aside, woman. This is the talk of warriors." "And I am telling you this warrior's path leads to the graves of our children," she retorted, her voice rising to meet his. "Look at them, Chaitin. They don't stand there out of strength. They are desperate. They are cornered animals. They expect us to attack. It's a trap, and you are leading us right into it." "It is a trap of sick men we can easily overcome," he sneered. "You have no stomach for this fight. You never have. My stomach is strong enough to see the truth," Anaba shot back, gesturing toward the creek. "Their sickness has made them careless, but it has not taken their bullets. An attack is what Silas wants. It gives him the excuse he needs to wipe us out. But if we wait, if we are patient, their own desperation will consume them. A camp with no gold and no health will not survive the winter." Her words, filled with a logic born of careful observation, began to seep into the crowd. Some of the older warriors lowered their spears, their expressions thoughtful. They had seen the truth in her eyes before. Chaitin saw his support wavering and his rage focused entirely on her. "You speak of patience while our families thirst," he spat. "Your cowardice will be our undoing." "And your pride will be our end," Anaba replied, standing her ground. The tribe was now frozen, caught between two opposing wills, the air thick with tension. At the creek, the miners watched, waiting for the move that would seal everyone's fate. The air over the contested spring was brittle, ready to shatter. Chaitin's warriors, their faces painted with streaks of ochre and black, clutched their bows, muscles coiled with a tension that mirrored the tribe's fractured spirit. They watched the miners' guards, who shifted uneasily, their rifles held loose but ready. Anaba stood between the two simmering factions, the weight of her people's fate a physical pressure on her chest. Chaitin's gaze was a hot brand on her, a silent accusation of cowardice. She knew she had only hours before his rage boiled over, before he led them all into a slaughter. That night, as a sliver of moon offered little light, a new plan took root in Anaba's mind, born from desperation and a memory. Weeks ago, while scouting, she had found a discarded arrowhead near the northern ridge, flint chipped in the distinctive style of the Washoe, a tribe with whom they had a history of territorial friction. It was a single, forgotten piece of evidence she now intended to weaponize. She moved like a shadow, her feet silent on the dry pine needles. She didn't go toward the miners' camp, but circled wide, approaching the trail that led east, their only route away from the valley. There, in the soft dirt, she pressed the Washoe arrowhead into the ground, leaving it just visible enough to be found by a searching eye. Then, taking a heavy pine bough, she swept the earth, creating a chaos of tracks that blurred into the illusion of a large party passing through. It was a deception of scale, a story told in dust and stone. Her final act was the cruelest and most necessary. She found the carcass of a black-tailed deer, brought down by a mountain lion days earlier. Gritting her teeth against the stench, she dragged it through the underbrush, leaving a grim trail that ended 100 paces from the miner's new water source. She arranged the ravaged body to look less like a predator's kill and more like a deliberate, brutal warning. A territorial marker left by an unseen enemy. Dawn broke, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and pink. The discovery was made not with a shout, but with a choked cry of fear. A young miner, sent to scout the trail, came sprinting back to the camp, clutching the Washoe arrowhead. His panic was infectious. Soon, a group led by Silas was staring at the disturbed ground and the savaged deer. The pieces fell together in their fevered minds exactly as Anaba had hoped. The sickness had weakened their bodies. This new evidence shattered their nerve. They were not just facing a small, desperate Maidu tribe. They were facing a confederation, a ghost army lurking just beyond the trees. Silas's paranoia, already festering, became a full-blown certainty of conspiracy. His authority crumbled as his men, pale and gaunt from the lingering illness, began to openly defy him. "We're done, Silas," one man coughed, his voice raspy. "I'm not dying out here for a handful of dust, not with a whole damn army waiting for us." From the ridge, Chaitin watched the commotion, his hand tightening on his bow. He saw the miners arguing, packing their mules with frantic energy. He saw their fear, but he couldn't understand its source. He turned to Anaba, who had appeared quietly beside him. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl of confusion. "Patience," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the camp below. "You were right, they are weak, but not from your arrows. They are being defeated by their own fear." Within the hour, the exodus began. The miners, who had arrived with arrogant bluster, now fled with their heads bowed, casting terrified glances into the woods. Silas was the last to leave. He stopped his horse and stared up at the hills, his face a mask of impotent rage. He was looking for an enemy to fight, a warrior to blame, but found only silent trees. He had been undone by a threat that was never there. With a final curse, he spurred his horse and followed his men. The Medu descended from the hills, not with a war cry, but in stunned silence. They walked to their spring, touching the cool, clean water now freed from guard. The dam remained, a scar on the river, but it could be broken. Chaitan stood beside Anaba, the war paint on his face suddenly looking out of place. He did not ask how she had done it. He simply looked at the departing dust cloud, then at her. "You saved us," he said, the words heavy with a respect he had never shown her before. Not with a warrior's blade, but with this. He gestured to her head, acknowledging her mind, her strategy. Anaba watched the last of the miners disappear. The river was still wounded, her people were still fragile, but they were alive, and they were home. She had faced the storm not by meeting its force head-on, but by guiding it away. In the quiet morning, by the water she had reclaimed, Anaba understood that leadership was not always a shout, but sometimes a whisper that could move mountains.